This week we are talking about the plant kingdom. This week we'll do general information about plants and the non-vascular plants, the seedless plants. And then next week we will do the more complicated vascular and flowering plants. So first of all, a quick review from what we were talking about and Tim and Moby. What is the vascular tissue in plants? The vascular tissue in plants is what? It carries water. And what is it? It's a system of tubes that carries water and food all over the plant. So this allows the plants to be bigger and to live in many different environments. So let's take a look here. So in the plant kingdom, that's too much information. Let's back it up a little bit there. You should write this down. So on your plant poster, you've got two main sections for today. One is general information about plants, which is this. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about the seedless plants, which will be a second section. So kingdom, the plant kingdom, kingdom plantae, if you want to go with the Latin, and it is domain eukarya. They all have eukaryotic cells. They all have cells with a nucleus and all the organelles. On the quiz last week, on Friday, in every single class, one or two people asked me on that matching part, they said, well, what if it's a kingdom that only has some prokaryotic or some eukaryotic? Every single kingdom is either all prokaryotic or all eukaryotic. So the only prokaryotic are bacteria, archaea, and then eukaryotic are everything else. It's such a huge difference in type of cell that you don't have both in the same kingdom. You do have single-celled and multi-celled in the same kingdom, but not prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So these are eukaryotic cells, and in this kingdom, all of them, every single last species is multicellular and complex. There are no single-celled plants. If you think it's a single-celled plant, what is it? It's a protist, right? We got the plant-like protists, the algae, even the giant kelps, those are all plant-like protists. So all of the plants are multicellular and complex. They have cells, tissues, organs, which are things like leaves and stems and roots and flowers. And so the plants live pretty much everywhere. The interesting thing, yesterday we did that Do Now, where we talked about all the different types of plants. So you guys saw your class and 5th period, but here's 6th period, all sorts of different types of plants, and 5th period, that's you guys, and 4th period, which you saw, and 2nd period, and 1st period. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, the point of this activity is that before we even started studying plants, we came up with really over 100 different types of plants. So they're things that we are familiar with. And part of that is because they live everywhere and they're big enough to see. In the plants, the other thing the textbook said that I thought was a little confusing, I know several of you asked me about it. The textbook, when it was talking about plants, the first part it says, imagine algae in the water, absorbing water into every cell. And several people asked me about that. They said, well, now it's saying algae is a plant. They were doing that to contrast. Algae, the plant-like protists, because they are very simple, even if they're multicellular, they don't need a system to transport water, right? Because how do they get water to all their cells? Yeah, they just absorb it. They live in water. So the plant-like protists do not need a system. They don't need stems and roots and veins and stuff like that. So then all plants are autotrophs. Once again, the textbook starts with a sentence that says nearly all plants are autotrophs. Not sure, but we're going to write down that all plants are autotrophs. All plants are autotrophs. I don't know why the textbook said that. A couple of people thought maybe it was because of things like the Venus flytrap and the carnivorous plants. They are still autotrophs. They just also are heterotrophs because they eat the insects kind of like as a vitamin supplement. But they are autotrophs. They are plants. They don't move to get their food. They respond to their environment, but they do not get up and move around. So the Venus flytraps, right, so here's my beautiful Venus flytrap, right? And so if a fly lands here, right, the leaves, these are modified leaves, close shut and it digests the flies. But it doesn't have muscles, it doesn't have nerves. What it is the reason it moves like that, we're going to call that responding to the environment, not moving to get its food, because it can't move from place to place. The other thing is, what happens is, imagine if you have like a suction cup and you turn it inside out. And then you put that inside out suction cup down on the table, right? So it's kind of inside out suction cup. And then if you touch it, it pops and moves back the way it was. That's similar to what's happening here. Because of the water pressure and the shape, and then if the fly touches these little hairs, it makes it pop closed. And then eventually, once the fly is digested, it fills back with water and goes back to the open shape. But it is not moving in the same way that animals do. So it is an autotroph. It definitely needs the sun to survive. It's just that it also eats insects. Yes? All right, moving on. So we have, so they're all autotrophs. They are at the bottom of the energy pyramid. They are producers, right? They all do photosynthesis, and all life on Earth depends on plants for their energy, for their food. Plants can do this amazing thing where they make food using the sunlight and carbon dioxide and water. And because of that, they can make food that every other living thing on Earth can eat. Or we eat things that eat plants. Animals, we can't make energy from the sun. We can't use that for food. And besides, we use much more energy than plants. So we just eat them because they stored it all up for us. But again, on the energy pyramid, these are the producers. Everything else depends on them. Yes? Mushrooms have cell walls, but it's a different material. It's made out of chitin, like the exoskeletons of insects. So that's why mushrooms are not plants. Mushrooms also don't do photosynthesis, and sunlight will kill them. Okay, moving on. They use spores like the simple plants, yes. So, moving on, the plants do live everywhere on our planet, except for Antarctica, but they have many different adaptations, living in the desert, living at high altitudes, rainforest, grasslands, different types of flowers, different types of leaves, and we will look at some of those this week in this lab and in our rotating lab station, and we'll also look at it, of course, next week as we look at flowering plants and some different adaptations of flowers and pollination. Yes? So unless it's really rocky, they do live. So once you get above the tree line, you'll have the tundra, and you have really small plants because it's fairly dry, and it's very harsh, and the summers are very short. So the tundra plants are the ones at the highest altitude. Above that, it might be really rocky, but you probably will still get some lichens. If there's water and sunlight, it'll grow. And here in Colorado, it's kind of cool because we do actually get to see the tundra type environments. All right, and how do plants reproduce? Plants reproduce both sexually and asexually. And this is something that some of you had wrong on your plant labs. Some people on your plant lab said, oh, fungi are different than plants because fungi can reproduce asexually and sexually. So can plants. And as far as I know, all plants can reproduce both asexually and sexually. So asexual reproduction is going to make an exact copy, a clone. And when you think about, say, your house plants, you could just cut a piece off and grow a new root. Cactus reproduce this way. Part of it will stick to an animal and go land somewhere else and grow roots. Some of the other ways it reproduces asexually that we talked about last week are growing roots under the ground, kind of like the mushrooms do. The roots grow under the ground and grow up somewhere else. Aspen trees do that, sumac trees. Somebody earlier today mentioned strawberries. This is my not very good picture of a strawberry. So you've got the strawberry plants, and they send out those runners. And then a new strawberry plant grows here. And the new strawberry plant goes here. And so these runners go above the ground. Spider plants do the same thing. And I'll put our spider plant down for the lab tomorrow. A lot of the vines, raspberries do this underground thing like this, and so you'll just get this whole bushy grove of raspberries. I don't know about grapevines, how they do. They might, because I know a lot of vines, as they grow on something, there'll be little roots that hold on to it. Um, but again, with a vine, if part of it breaks off, and they can have those little roots at the nodes, they'll be able to grow onto something else. So yeah, I would imagine so. And most of these also have flowers and seeds to reproduce as well. And then real quickly here, the seedless plants, um, spores. I put down that they must have water to reproduce, but Tim and Moby said that the spores sometimes are just only are dispersed by the wind. So I might be wrong on that one. Sexual reproduction is when you've got pollen, seeds, flowers, pine cones, fruits. All of those things are sexual reproduction. The spores are sexual reproduction, but the pollen is basically um, has the male genes, and then the seeds or the eggs are the female, and then they fertilize, and so you've got traits from both parents. Like with Mendel's plants, right? Or like with the fast plants, you've got the pollen and the flowers. Okay, couple questions. Questions? No questions. The plants are broken into two major groups. So the non-vascular plants and the vascular plants. It might make more sense to talk about the vascular plants first, because these are the plants that we're most familiar with. As you look at the list of all the different types of plants there are, all the different plants we listed as we talked about them, almost every single one of those is a vascular plant. Vascular tissue in animals is the blood vessels. It transports materials. So vascular plants have a system of veins to move food and water. Of course, they don't have a heart or anything that pumps it. The water moves just by evaporating from the leaves and being sucked up the roots, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. But this vascular system allows trees to be very tall. It allows plants to live very far away from water. Ferns, we should actually probably move the ferns over here. The ferns are a vascular plant, but they're seedless. They have spores. So we're going to skip those for a minute. But the vascular tissue and the seeds allow adaptations for living things, or for the plants to live really everywhere on Earth. The flowering plants, evergreens, grasses. And we're going to talk about these next week in a great amount of detail. But those are the plants you're most familiar with. Think about eating a piece of celery, right? And you get that stringy stuff stuck in your teeth. That's the vascular tissue. So that's what it looks like. So the non-vascular plants that we talk about this week, they have no system to move water and food around. So because of this, they must be small. They're very short. They must live near water because they do not have sophisticated root systems. There's no seeds. The spores need water to reproduce. Now the ferns are seedless but vascular. And you guys know what ferns look like. They have these, they're kind of waxy, wiry pond fronds. And I have some real pictures here. But then on the bottom of the leaf, is it? I don't know. So ferns are obviously vascular, but they do not have seeds. So let's take a look at a couple different types of pictures. The non-vascular plants, again, the mosses, for instance. Here's my little pictures of mosses. It's a tiny little plant with tiny little roots. And they grow just in these carpets of thousands and thousands of little plants. So let's take a couple looks here. So yeah, here are some common pictures of mosses. Again, here in Colorado, it's a relatively dry environment, so we don't have a lot of moss. But you do see it like along the creek, permanent creeks that flow all the time, you'll see it. And it looks like this, or an area near a waterfall. If you're hiking in the mountain, if there's areas on the rocks where it's fairly moist, you'll see it grow. Let me see, these ones, and these ones, if you look a little closer, they're actually individual plants making up this whole thing. These ones, Tim and Moby in the textbook goes into a lot more detail about the bryophytes and the liverworts and the hornworts. Don't worry about those. Those basically just have these bigger, flatter leaves. I'm not going to ask you about that. But these are the mosses, and this is what they look like. They reproduce with spores, and they actually send up a little spore capsule on this little thing, and then this has the spores in it. And so that you can kind of see those there. This is just a close-up of the little moss plants. That's what they look like. Again, you'll see them, and you can just literally peel them off the rocks. and you'll see those tiny little roots. They actually anchor into the rock and start breaking down the rock. And as Tim and Moby mentioned, they break down the rock and start making soils. This one up here, you can see a little bit more of those individual plants. Then, these are the ferns. You guys all know what ferns look like. Oh, this one's actually a moss. This is the moss where you can see actually the individual plants. There's a picture like this in your textbook. So this is the little moss plant here, little stems and leaves, and this is a little capsule. They're still very small, but that's what they look like. Here's a fern, and one of the way the ferns can reproduce by those underground roots, or on the bottoms of the leaves, you see, it's a little hard to see here, but these are the little dots. Those are the spore cases, and there's some just different pictures of ferns. Ferns are a fairly primitive plant. They've been around forever. I think that is everything. As we look at that, you've got that information on your posters. Tomorrow's lab, our rotating lab station for Wednesday, Thursday, you will start by looking, well, actually, you'll just jump in at whatever point, but it starts from very simple things. You'll see mosses, you'll see ferns, you will see some lichens, even though they're not a plant. We've got some lichens to show you. And then you'll also see some of the other plant adaptations, different types of roots and stems and leaves that help plants live everywhere. And that is Chapter 8, Sections 1 and 2, if you want to review that in the textbook.